Does anyone know the name Gabriel Prosser? My conscience says he's the one that history missed. A blacksmith by trade up in Brookfield plantation. A Henrico County slave born to owner Thomas. If you listen closely, you'll hear the words perfect.
You know, I studied Gabriel's uprising many years ago, and then years later I was talking to some friends, and I figured everyone knew the story, and apparently not everyone does know the story. And then a couple days later I was walking, you know, I asked some friends and they had never heard the name Gabriel before, and I was walking a couple days later with Emma at the James River, and the song just wrote itself in my head. I believe that you die twice, or I've been told you die twice. The first time is when you're physically gone, and the second time is when the memory of you is gone. And Gabriel was an honorable person, and I figure singing a song about him does him great justice. And I'm lucky enough to be able to tour and sing songs all over the world, and I've sang this song about Gabriel everywhere.
Does anyone know the name Gabriel Prosser? My conscience says he's the one that history missed.
Gabriel's Rebellion is an important event in American history. It takes place at a point in our history where you can lay it side by side with the sort of revolutionary ideology of the country. And it encapsulates the fundamental contradiction, you know, the fundamental contradiction, you know, being that of race and that of the idea of freedom and who's entitled to it.
We can look at Gabriel's Rebellion, it's two-sided. We can think, here's a man that wants to come in and kill and destroy the white population here, the government that is just starting. It could really cause our country to crumble. They could think that this is anarchy. But I lean more on the side of he's a human being asking what we all ask, to be treated fairly, to be treated honestly.
Had Virginia's leadership been kind of shocked into action by Gabriel's plan, had they passed some kind of law for gradual emancipation, no Nat Turner debacle, no Virginia secession in 1861, no 700,000 dead Americans who died because the founding fathers could not do what they knew they should be doing. And so that was kind of a major turning point, not just for Virginia or Henrico, but for the Republic. And it was a moment in which Virginia's leadership failed.
Gabriel Prosser was born at an interesting time, 1776, which is right at the beginning of the American Revolution. And by the time the revolution ended, he's like 7, 8. It was an interesting time because freedom was being established. There's a lot of talk about freedom, and word is thrown around a lot, but it was a time period where freedom was beginning to be defined, not only as it related to the colonists, quote unquote, or the quote unquote Americans, but also with the black community and the dichotomy of this being a free society with slavery.
Gabriel was a slave, that he was raised here in Henrico County. We know that he grew up at Brookfield, Thomas Prosser's plantation that isn't very far from Meadow Farm.
His master knew exactly how old he was, like down to the month, and so that suggests that he wasn't purchased as a child, that he was born there on Brookfield. He appears for the first time in 1783 on a census. When the war was over, Virginia did this sort of giant census, and it's the one time that slaves appear by name and not simply by number. And there he is, young boy Gabriel. We don't know much about Gabriel's family, unhappily. He had a wife. She is referred to only once in the trial documents. She's called Nanny, and that may be an occupational nickname.
Gabriel had two brothers that we know of, Martin and Solomon, that were raised with him on Brookfield Plantation.
We don't know who his parents were. He's trained to be a blacksmith, and usually people inherit the occupation of their parent if they're enslaved. So most likely, and one of his brothers is also a blacksmith, so most likely his father was also a blacksmith. Slaves are not allowed to inherit property, but they can inherit the somewhat better status of a parent. And so the daughters of domestics become domestics, and the daughters of craftsmen become craftsmen.
He and his brothers are growing up on that plantation. He's approximately the same age as the owner's son, Thomas Jr. My readings have shown that he and Thomas kind of played together as little boys, and he will grow into a tall, strong, skilled worker who offers a certain kind of income to the plantation, is useful on the plantation for a time, but once tobacco's played out and once they really start needing to diversify their revenue streams, he's also rented out in Richmond. So he has an access to Richmond as a young man that is a little bit unusual for people who live their lives on the plantation in the agricultural slavery systems.
If you are a workman that could be trusted to be hired out, then you would travel. You would have a pass, and you could travel by horseback, by wagon, to all around the state to work. And the money that they earned would be given to them, and they would then be sent to the master. And so the master would make money, but also the slave received some recompense for his work. It's hard for us to understand that in early times in Virginia in slavery, that slaves had a degree of freedom that we don't imagine. We see life sort of post-Gabriel, but before that event happened, they had a degree of freedom. Of course, it wasn't really freedom.
There is some speculation that Gabriel could read and write, and it's speculation because in large part, Black people, both enslaved and free, were not encouraged to become literate or to receive an education. But as a blacksmith, he would need those skills. He would need to know how to read and write to be able to perform his trade efficiently and effectively.
To have an enslaved person with mobility and literacy is remarkable. He probably had many, many kinds of employers, many kinds of customers. He would hang out in the taverns after work. For a time, that was still possible. It is likely that he got to know people who were travelers coming through Richmond. And in the years when he was an adult young man, he's around and he's literate. He's able to read pamphlets. He's able to read journals and newspapers and things that are coming through. And we are talking about the revolutionary first 25 years of the existence of the United States. So there's an awful lot of rhetoric around, and a lot of people who are not quite so sure that slavery ought to exist. And he's getting exposed to that, and he's synthesizing that information and combining it with his personal experience with life on the plantation, with life as an enslaved laborer in the city of Richmond. And I'm sure that clashes with his own personal dreams.
I think for Gabriel, there's a moment in time, and that's when, in 1799, he and his brother and one of his friends are stealing a neighbor's hog, and of course most slaves are not getting enough protein on the table, and so slaves are always stealing, especially from neighbors, hogs, the occasional, cow, that kind of thing, and trying to get protein on the table, and he's caught, and the neighbor berates him, and of course he's supposed to then play the slave game, look down, shuffle his feet, apologize, be very obsequious, and he just kind of snaps, and he dives at the person's knees, and they have this kind of punching, rolling around on the ground contest going on, and he finally bites off the better part of the neighbor's left ear. So that's now a capital crime. He's attacked a white man.
He is arrested, and he would have been sentenced to death, but they have sort of a loophole that if you can recite passages from the Bible to show that you are God-fearing, then you would not be executed. You would be publicly whipped and humiliated, and then you would be branded with some kind of mark to forever label you as a person not quite trustworthy, that you had committed some kind of act against a white person.
Obviously, he knew he was a slave, but this is a reminder that despite his size, his ability, his literacy, the fact that he is badly deeded as an economic cog on the plantation, that he is in fact a thing who's now been brutalized by the state of Virginia. The public whipping is of course, conscious embarrassment. It's designed to remind people where they stand.
It is difficult to say what would make a person take decisive action, especially when that action has such dire consequences, the possibility of dire consequences. To know that you're not on the same level with others, that you are in fact property and owned by someone. It would be wearing, and it would make, I would imagine, a person say, no more. Something has to be done.
Because Gabriel is a skilled bondman who hires his time on occasion, he clearly knows people like himself at other estates. And because he is fairly mobile, when he's able to go to those estates, and he knows kind of who to contact. So in other words, he's dealing with people very much like himself.
He meets a fellow slave by the name of Jack Ditcher, and their personalities must have been similar. They were probably both very intelligent men, skilled men, and they discussed, maybe at first in jest, what could we do, and supposition of how can we end this life of servitude.
Young Spring was an area that enslaved people would gather there. On Sundays, that was where they could go. You get some privacy from the people who control your lives. And there's obviously some understanding on the part of the enslavers that they understand that people need this, right? You can't repress people every single minute of the day without knowing that there's going to be a loss at the end of it, or a challenge at the end of that. So people get their Sundays for this time. And to know that this was also a place maybe for them where they felt like, where they could be safe with themselves, for Gabriel and his co-conspirators to introduce this element of profound danger into that space also, I know was not comfortable for everybody.
And so finally on August 10, they have this big meeting at Young Spring. It's a Sunday, and there's been a child's funeral, and so people have gathered. And Gabriel announces that anybody who's with him to stand up, and those who aren't just to keep sitting down. And of course, who's going to be sitting down while everyone else is rising up?
Gabriel must have had quite a formidable personality and very good and articulate speech, and he's able to persuade other slaves that are probably very frightened. The thought of rising up against your master, they would have known that this was cause that they could be killed. Even talking about such things would be a death sentence to them if they were found. So Gabriel must have been persuasive and articulate enough to have other slaves join him, and he's given the title of general for his ability to recruit other slaves.
So the plan was to gather a group to march into Richmond on that Saturday, August 30th, as the sun was going down, that they would split into 3 formations. One would go to the warehouses along the river. and set a fire, drawing the town's militia all there. Another group would go to the armory where they had prearranged with the man who was in charge of the keys to the armory to let them in so that they could arm themselves, and then they were going to regroup as a solid group and move on the governor's mansion and take Governor Monroe hostage and negotiate for the end of slavery and access, basically, to the economic system.
Gabriel's skill at being a blacksmith enabled him to fashion weapons, makeshift weapons, that would be quite lethal. He could turn any of the plowshares, which you would use to turn the ground, which can be very sharp. He could turn them into weapons. Size that you use to cut wheat crops and such could be easily turned into weapons. Pikes could be made.
And there was a flag made, I understand, of silk that said death or liberty, inverting the words of Patrick Henry's, give me liberty or give me death. And the fact that he inverted it to say death first signifies just how far they were willing to go in pursuit of freedom, in pursuit of liberty.
What Gabriel did was Gabriel gave a methodical plan in order to get to the governor. What is unknown is what's the governor going to do? Is the governor just going to, the governor would simply say, okay, what I'll do is I'll set all of you free. Now go back to your houses. That ain't happening. So, you know, that's like the end. Okay, you've told me what you're going to do, but then what's he going to do? So there are a lot of wild cards at the end, but to get to the end would be impressive.
I think there's every reason to believe that the plan would have been successful. It might have been kind of a bloody mess in which Gabriel dies and maybe Monroe dies, but it certainly had every possibility of getting off the ground, and then the skies just opened. And anyone who's ever been caught in a late summer rain in Virginia, it's not raining. I mean, it's pouring. What had been a tiny creek suddenly is a river. Small bridges near Brookfield are being washed away. Almost nobody gets to kind of the rendezvous point. According to one document, Nanny's there, Gabriel's there, Jack Ditcher is there, but not nearly enough men to start. And so they hold this kind of quick meeting and decide to push everything back for one night.
We believe there may have been at least 1,000 people involved. And when you have a group that large, it's not going to be as cohesive as you would like, because some began to doubt what they're doing.
You have a lot of people who have been holding themselves together in anticipation of this day and this hour. And when they have to delay, you can imagine that people begin to break.
Other slaves, the slaves that hadn't been able to meet there because of the terrible conditions of the weather, I'm sure they were thinking over again, is this really the best course for us to take? Is it worth the cost of what could happen? And one of those slaves is Pharoah, and he lives here at Meadow Farm. And he's only 27 years old. He's got a wife and a young son. And I'm sure that this gave him great pause if he should go forward with this. So Pharoah decides that he needs to speak to someone. And he goes to Tom, who is a fellow slave here at Meadow Farm. He's owned by Mosby Sheppard. And he suggests that they go and talk to Mosby Sheppard. That shows a level of trust that he has with his master, that they need to go speak with them.
And of course, one of the ways that any slave society exists is by offering incentives to those who have useful information. And they finally do decide to go and tell their owner, Mosby Sheppard, of what's going on. And he is able to get word into town. He writes something out. He also kind of gallops into town and gets word to Monroe, who then calls out the militia in Henrico and the area all around Richmond, and that's when Gabriel finally decides to run for it.
So he parts from his wife. and he takes to the safest place that he knows, and that is the Chickahominy Swamp, which is very near Brookfield. And it's a way for him to hide. It'll be harder for the mounted militia to find him and track him, and it leads him to the James River, and he's able to find a sympathetic captain there that has a ship named Mary, and on the ship are also slaves that he knows. So he feels a degree of safety that he can escape. He's able to board the ship. The ship will take him to Norfolk.
And when they get there, there is a reward that Governor Monroe has posted. And so there's a slave on the ship. He doesn't want to turn Gabriel in, but the reward could possibly buy his freedom. And so he notifies authorities in Norfolk, and they board the ship and take Gabriel away. And in the final kind of classic irony of ironies, because the person who turns him in is a black man, he only gets part of the reward and not enough to buy his own freedom.
And it is there that he is apprehended and brought back in chains to Richmond to stand trial.
He must have felt some abject sense of failure on the one hand, but just because this chapter of the rebellion and this chapter of the struggle for liberation was over, the next one wasn't. That's an extraordinary moment for someone who's a leader, is to recognize that he may have been the leader for that time, but it was going to go to the next person or people.
October 6th is the date for his trial, but it's really a farce. All of the individuals that are there know that this is just once again the whites saying one thing and will do another. I'm sure they wanted him to confess and say, I was wrong, I'm so sorry. But he was a proud man, and he was not going to do that. At the end of the trial, of course, he was found guilty. And for him to be executed, he's a slave. So for you to execute a slave means you have to reimburse the master that owns him. So the value of $500 is placed upon him that will be paid to his owner. And that must have been a terrible insult to Gabriel.
When Gabriel and his men are hanged, they're hanged in very strategic places. Some are hanged in Brookfield, so that they bring slaves, and masters will force their slaves to come and watch. So these are very public executions. So some are executed in Richmond, some out in Henrico, some in front of the tavern that Prosser owns. They want as many slaves to see this is the price of thinking about armed freedom and liberation. And so the fact that no one dies is irrelevant. They have to make an example.
One of the things that Gabriel had asked, a dying man's request, was that he not be hung alone, that he would have his friends with him that had been sentenced to death also. But when he is taken by cart to the execution site, he realizes he will have that final insult of his wish not being followed through, that he will have to die alone.
And so, so the man who's at the center of this vast conspiracy dies by himself. He dies in Richmond, so probably Nanny is not there to see him die, and any kind of comfort that he might have derived from that to see her there in the audience. And then, of course, the gallows is the old Negro burial ground, and so you hang him and then plant him right there. The body does not go back to the family. There's no last rites for the family to grieve. He just kind of disappears, and word arrives that he's been hanged. The event was enormous. The failed conspiracy, I think, really shocked white Virginians. Stories appeared in newspapers up and down the East Coast, from Massachusetts all the way down to Savannah, Georgia. Long descriptions of the executions and the trials. I think especially when it became clear how vast it was. It was not just a handful of slaves in Henrico, but that it finally essentially had branches from Henrico to Norfolk to Petersburg. A handful of slaves apparently in Charlottesville knew about it. It doesn't mean they're actively involved, but they knew about it and kept silent. And I think that's kind of what really stunned America.
The result of Gabriel's failed insurrection had the effect of what he didn't want to have happen. The slave laws became more strongly enforced. Life for African Americans at this time became much harder.
The laws became much more restrictive. You began to see much fewer manumissions and emancipations. Laws were created that said once you became free, you had to leave the state. You could not be educated, you could not own firearms, you could not gather in an assembly. It was with the intention of keeping people in their place.
I think this event was tremendous, and I think that one of the things that we don't quite focus on is the fact that it was really important not only to condemn him, to execute him, to make his burial place unknowable. We do not know where he was buried. And also to, as quickly as possible, erase the memory of this rebellion. That was very important to do. You could not have his story linger as something, as a beacon for people.
The cry that Gabriel gives to the world is simply the cry of every man, that I wish to be free. I wish to be treated as you are treated. And we are known for our founding fathers from Virginia, and they all asked the same question that Gabriel asked. And they're remembered in our pantheon of history, whereas Gabriel is often unnoted and looked over his story when it resonates, I think, with everyone.